Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast delving into one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan. This Wednesday, Israel marked Jerusalem Day, which celebrates the reunification of Jerusalem following the 1967 Six-Day War. But the capital has a rich and fascinating history of rulership changes since its foundation in about 1000 BCE. Professor Jodi Magness just published her latest book, Jerusalem Through the Ages, From Its Beginnings to the Crusades, through the Oxford University Press. She stopped by the Times of Israel's Jerusalem offices to speak about the eternal ancient city's rulerships and populations throughout the eras. Jerusalem Throughout the Ages is a 700-page weighty tome that delves into the city's history through archaeological evidence and also texts, including the Bible and extra biblical materials such as the Egyptian Amarna letters. Magness is the Kenan Distinguished Professor for Teaching Excellence in Early Judaism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the author of 11 books. From 2011 until 2023, Magness directed excavations at Huqoq in Israel's Galilee and uncovered breathtaking mosaics. So this Jerusalem Day, we take a quick break from our current war and ask archaeologist Professor Jodi Magness, what mattered then? Jodi, thank you so much for joining me today in our Jerusalem offices.
Well, thank you for having me, Amanda.
Such a pleasure always to speak with you. Now, this week, we in Israel are marking Jerusalem Day, which marks the reunification of the capital city, Jerusalem, in 1967. And you just coincidentally happened to just write a book called Jerusalem Through the Ages. Your quest in this book, which is over 700 pages in the print version, is to match up different accounts, meaning the text as we know it, which obviously a lot of it comes from the Bible, but not just, to match all of that up with the archaeological evidence and see what Jerusalem was like throughout the ages. And one of the threads that you pull through a lot of the different eras, you start, of course, with the Jebusite era and move on, is the use of water, which I thought was very interesting. But I'm kind of more interested, because of Jerusalem Day, to speak about the composition of the city in different eras. So in the Jebusite era, for example, there are texts outside of the Bible from Egypt, for example. And what are we hearing through those texts about who lived in Jerusalem then?
Right. Oh, let me just, before we continue, just qualify and say that my goal was not to match the biblical text with the archaeology, but rather to use all available sources of evidence, whether it's the biblical books or outside sources like we have from Egypt, as you just mentioned, and the archaeology. They don't necessarily all correspond. They, most of the time, don't necessarily give the same information, provide the same kind of information. Sometimes they appear to be contradictory, the different sources. But yes, my goal was to sort of provide a comprehensive overview based on the different kinds of sources that we have.
We're not here to prove the Bible.
Exactly, right. And that should not definitely be the goal of archaeology, right? Archaeology is not a handmaiden to proving the Bible or anything like that. So we do have ancient texts from Egypt, from the 18th and 14th centuries BCE, where Jerusalem is mentioned by an earlier name, Rushalimum, or Urusalim is how I think it's usually pronounced. And there we get a picture of sort of a kind of, it's a picture that's typical of the Bronze Age, and especially the latter part of the Bronze Age, where it's at this point Kenan still, right, is divided into a series of these kind of small city-states, usually with some sort of a fortified city or urban center at the core. And so we have texts that were sent, letters basically, that were sent by the governor or ruler of Jerusalem to Egypt, requesting help, to the pharaoh, requesting assistance from various outside threats. And so, it's a picture that's actually largely consistent with what we know about the division of the country in the latter part of the Bronze Age.
In terms of archaeology, obviously these letters are evidence and they're things you can hold in your hand, etc. But in terms of the archaeology of what we see on the ground here in that era, I mean, there are so many different theories about what the kingdom was. There's, of course, the nomadic theory that is getting some kind of popularity recently, that King David was more of a nomad, and that's why we don't have a lot of proof. But what are you actually seeing in terms of the, shall we call it, invasion or the conquering of the city at that point?
Yeah, actually, I can't think of a single example where we have archaeological evidence of destruction in the city that might be associated with King David, or let's say the time of King David. People who read the book will see that archaeologists are very divided among themselves about the nature and extent of the city in the latter part of the Bronze Age. And then as it looked, after it comes under, let's say, the rule of David, there's even debates about that. And so the problem is that the archaeological remains are very scrappy, very meager. And therefore, some archaeologists think that the city, I don't even know if we could call it a city, but let's say that the city was very small in the latter part of the Bronze Age, whereas some think that it was bigger. Either way, in general, the archaeological evidence doesn't really look like what you would expect the capital of a kingdom like the Kingdom of David to look like. And that's what's generated a lot of the debates. Now, I think actually that the archaeological picture doesn't necessarily have to be inconsistent in that regard with the biblical account. It could be that, and I actually have this at the end of the relevant chapter in my book, that capital cities don't always look like you think that they're going to look like. If you think about, the capitals of the, let's say Tallahassee in Florida, for example, where I grew up, right? Well, it's not the biggest city, Albany in New York, right? So what's a capital city should look like? Well, that doesn't necessarily mean. But then on the other hand, is it possible, if not even likely, that the biblical writers who wrote these stories at a later date, isn't it possible that they exaggerated or embellished the appearance of Jerusalem in their accounts because by then it really was such an important city? So that's also quite possible. So here again is this sort of problem of trying to match the archaeological remains with what we might expect to find based on the biblical account alone.
One thing you noted in that chapter, if I'm not mistaken, is the location of Jerusalem itself is kind of bizarre because it's not on the main thoroughfare.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a really interesting thing. And in this regard, Jerusalem is quite different from the other great cities of the Mediterranean world. If you think of Athens or Rome or Istanbul, all of them are big cities that existed over the course of many centuries, like Jerusalem. But they have location, right? They're on bodies of water. They have connections with the rest of the world. And Jerusalem was never like that. Jerusalem is basically, I like to describe it as a poor, isolated mountain town, not on any major trade routes or anything like that. Yes, there were roads that, went through and still go through the country in this area, but it was never a city that was important for that reason. And even until today, Jerusalem is the poorest major city in Israel. So the importance of Jerusalem, it's special, it's different from the other great cities of the Mediterranean world. Its specialness and its importance doesn't derive from a location on trade routes or a strategic location, but rather is really connected with the whole development of this being the location where the presence of the God of Israel dwells. And that is a tradition that has existed from way back until today.
You mentioned strategic location, and if I'm not wrong, three sides of the old city of ancient Jerusalem were pretty strategically protected by natural events, meaning cliffs and things of that nature.
Yes, that's true. So let's define strategic here. So when I'm talking about strategic, I mean in the big picture. So for example, in antiquity and even until today, the easiest route to go from the major power center to the south, in antiquity that was Egypt, to the northeast, the major power centers in the northeast, which were in Mesopotamia, the area of modern Iraq, let's say Syria, Iraq, the easiest way to go was always the coastal road, right? That's flat terrain. When Alexander the Great marches through with his army, he goes down the coast. I mean, the Pharaoh's armies, they always went at, why was Megiddo so strategic? Because it guarded the outlet of a mountain pass that you reached once you went up the coastal road and then you cut across. Jerusalem, on the other hand, lies in the middle of the country on top of a watershed of a mountain ridge. And so it's not a strategic. I mean, it doesn't mean that there weren't roads, but it's not a location where, generally speaking, anybody passed through on their way to get to somewhere else. So in that regard, that's what I mean by strategic. When what you're talking about is sort of the micro level, let's say. So that the city itself, yes, you're right, is perched on this sort of area that is, flanked by valleys. And in fact, the earliest settlement, which is what we call today the City of David, right? This little hill that comes out to the south of the Temple Mount, which is sometimes called the Eastern Hill or the Southeastern Hill or the Lower City. That hill is indeed protected on two of its three sides by deep valleys, the Kidron Valley on the east, the Tyropoeon Valley on the west. To the north, it simply rises up towards the Temple Mount. So in that regard, yes, it is a good location, but it was really chosen mainly because of its proximity to the water. You mentioned water. And of course, the major source of water in Jerusalem throughout time, and especially in its earliest periods, was the Gihon Spring. And that spring comes out of the ground at the eastern foot of that little spur, that hill. And that's really why that was selected as the place where people first settled and remained actually the heart of the city for a very long time after that.
Let's move on to the Israelite period. And one thing that, of course, anyone who reads the Bible is aware of is all the different kinds of peoples that were in the land, the Edomites and the Moabites and the Philistines, even, all the ites and the Philistines too. And my question is, what kind of evidence do we have of Jerusalem in terms of coexistence or a plethora of peoples at that time? Do we have anything like that?
Yeah, I think the main evidence, if we're thinking about the archaeological record, of course, we come from things that are written, where we have, things written in different languages. And most of what we have that falls into that category, just off the top of my head, would be these little clay ceilings, bullae. These are little lumps of clay, originally raw clay, that were used to seal documents. And they would be stamped with either images or sometimes with the name of the owner of the seal that made the impression into the lump of clay. And so we actually have hundreds of these little clay ceilings that have been found in excavations in Jerusalem. There are also some that have been acquired on the antiquities market. And some of them actually do bear images or inscriptions that indicate, trade with other peoples, connections with other peoples. And I do, again, cover this in the book. There are other items that we have that aren't so specific, but are very interesting. For example, one thing that readers might be surprised to find out is that there are shark's teeth that have been found in Iron Age contexts in Jerusalem, which indicate that, sharks may have been brought to the city. Maybe they ate shark meat. And in fact, the shark teeth include fossilized shark teeth that were brought from a great distance from the area of the Negev. And exactly what they were used for, why they were brought, is a whole nother mystery. So we have, and I should also mention, there are also a lot of fish bones that have been discovered in Iron Age contexts in Jerusalem, which indicate the fish, aside from sharks, were being brought from various points, whether to the north or the south or the Mediterranean. And so we do have a lot of evidence for trade and contacts between Jerusalem, the people of Jerusalem, and other parts of the country, and even other countries outside in the Iron Age.
So let's look at the Judahite era. And there's something there that has always puzzled me, and I think puzzles a lot of people. And that is the plethora of these terracotta figurines. And I always kind of wondered, okay, are these guys meant to be Jews who are using these, or are they the different peoples? Is this an opportunity to say, hey, there are a lot of different ethnicities that were living in Jerusalem at this time? Or I don't know. And it's also, of course, the period, or just after the period, when we hear about the Queen of Sheba coming. And so you understand that there are these intermarriages for probably political reasons going on. So what was the mix in Jerusalem then?
Yeah. By the way, Solomon had many, many non-Israelite wives, right? And of course, what we're talking about here is an Israelite population rather than a Jewish population, because we're before 586 BCE. So yeah, this is one of the mysteries, one of the many mysteries, is that more of these little clay figurines have been found in excavations in Jerusalem than at any other site in the country, which really kind of is completely contradictory to what you might think. They're these small clay figurines. They're called Judean pillar figurines, or Judahite pillar figurines, JPFs for short. And generally they're called that because they're sort of like, the body is cylindrical, is basically a cylinder, and then on top what you have is a head of a woman with features, and hair, and then her arms usually are shown crossed and cradling large breasts. And so, the emphasis, what seems to be an emphasis, first of all, they're female. What seems to be an emphasis on large breasts, or at least in some of them, sort of suggests a connection to fertility. And so many scholars have connected these with some sort of a worship of fertility cult, or like little Astarte figurines or something like that. Quite possible. I have a discussion of it in my book with the various views of different scholars, because there's a lot of debate whether these actually were, in fact, connected with some sort of a worship or a cult. I don't have strong opinions one way or the other about what they were used for, but I don't think that we should be surprised, because again, what we're looking at the past through our lenses today. And if you look at the overall material culture of now we're in late Iron Age Jerusalem, right? If you look at the overall material culture, we see a lot of outside influences. For example, on the forms of tombs, very clear, right? I have a big discussion of tombs, burial customs, and tombs. So of course, just like today, the ancient Israelites were part of a larger context in this region. And I don't think it's surprising to see other influences, other cultural influences on the material culture.
Okay, so we see in the next period in your book, the Persian period, we see from Ezra and Nehemiah this condemnation, which I found really interesting. And the idea of purity, what is a Jew? That's what you're talking about when you're talking about like, Jews began after that. But what do you make of that?
Of the concern with purity, or
the concern with purity and the intermarriage,
to separate yourselves. Yeah.
So does it mean that there was so much of it that it had to be condemned? Were they just seeing it so much in front of their eyes that they had to really come down strong? Or what's going on there, do you think?
Oh boy. Okay. So I'll admit now that you're a little outside my field of expertise as an archaeologist, because really what this goes to is evaluating sort of the relevant biblical books, in this case, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and also sort of what we might consider to be the origins of Judaism itself, right? Because as you say, we are now talking about a period of Judaism rather than the Israelite period, which preceded it. And so, this again has been the subject of a lot of debate among scholars. Why do we see this? I think that part of it, so I'm just going to say part of it, I think, has to do with the larger context. And that is that what we have are, in this period, we have Judahites, the former people of Judah from before 586 BCE, who had been sent into exile in Babylonia, and then some of them return, right, with Ezra after the Persian king Cyrus issues his edict, so about, let's say, 60 to 65 years after the initial exile, and they're allowed to come back. And it's important to bear in mind that the people who come back are elite. And when the Babylonians in 586 BC had exiled the people of Judah, the people who were exiled were the elite. The lower classes, who were the majority of the population, right? They remained behind. And in the meantime, they had intermarried with, non-Israelite peoples, which, by the way, was not uncommon before 586 BCE. But you see these elites coming back. And I think that part of what we are seeing here, at least part of it, is a sort of, I call it a snobbish elite concern for genealogical purity, right? The purity of bloodlines, which again is something that aristocrats, right? If you're going to, and so I think partly that is what is driving. So they come back, and of course, okay, so here are all these descendants of the original Judahite population who, in the meantime, had intermarried, and so I think that part of it reflects a worldview that is an elite worldview and a concern that is very much focused on purity of bloodlines. Now, I don't want to be overly simplistic, and I don't want to get attacked for saying this. So I would say I'm sure the picture is no doubt much more complex than that. But I do think that at least is part of what, drives this concern that we see. But I would rather leave it to, specialists in that particular field to figure out. I will say that of all the chapters in this book, the Persian period was actually the hardest one for me.
I was going to say, because as far as I understand it, we have very little archaeological evidence of this period in general in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think there's part of the problem has to do with the definition of what types of pottery may be late Iron Age versus Persian period. At any rate, the remains are scrappy. The city of Jerusalem, as it was rebuilt in the Persian period, was a very small and unimpressive looking city. So yes, the remains are scrappy. And then there is the whole problem of trying to correlate what we see in the archaeology with the biblical description, because of course, when Nehemiah rebuilds the walls, there's a description of, where the circuit of the wall ran and references to gates in the wall. And so trying to correlate the archaeological remains with what's described in the book of Nehemiah has proven to be very difficult, particularly because there are too many gates to fit in a very small circuit, which is what's usually thought to be Jerusalem was very small, just Temple Mount and the city of David. We have way too many gates to fit into such a small area. How do you resolve that? So there's a whole nother debate about that.
That's so interesting. And one thing we should have mentioned at the beginning is that a lot of what was built was reused in later periods, which also kind of muddies the waters.
That's exactly right. And that's something that I mentioned at the beginning and then also repeatedly throughout. And that goes back to what you asked at the beginning about the remains of the Bronze Age and and the early Iron Age. Why are they so hard to find? Well, part of the reason they're so hard to find is because what you have in Jerusalem, because basically Jerusalem's not a tell in the sort of classical sense, right? The classic, tell, you have layers that accumulate and form this kind of artificial mound. And you don't really get that in Jerusalem because the city's built on outcrops of bedrock. And so when people built, and even until today, by the way, a lot of times what you do is you clear down to bedrock because you want to put the foundations of your structures on bedrock. And so what happens is that earlier remains either tended to get wiped out as later building was constructed, or the earlier remains simply were rebuilt and reused over the course of many periods of time. And that's something that we see throughout the book as well.
Now, in terms of building on bedrock, I think the most stunning example that I've seen in Jerusalem, and I'm not the expert here, is, of course, the Western Wall. And what we see, how even the bedrock is shaped in this, very typical manner with the framing of the stones, dressed stones. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
You're referring to the Temenos wall of the Temple Mount, which, of course, is the wall that was built by King Herod the Great in the 1st century BCE when he rebuilt the Second Temple and expanded the size of the esplanade and then had to enclose it within a new wall. And the walls around the walls that Herod built, right, that Temenos wall, do go to a great depth below what we see today. And the investigation of those the parts that are underground has been going on for a very long time, since the 19th century. So I also have a chapter on earlier explorers of Jerusalem.
And I just want to plug that chapter because it's so helpful you get the personalities of the people you're going to be speaking about later on. And I really appreciated that. So when you're, of course, referring to Robinson, we know who he is already.
Right, exactly. And some of them are more my favorites than others. I mean, one of the really more, I think a little maybe more obscure to most people is Charles Clermont-Ganneau, who I think was a genius, actually. And when I was working on my dissertation, I kept coming up with these ideas that I thought, oh, this is a great idea. And then I would go and I would read Charles Clermont-Ganneau back in like the late 19th century or early 20th century and find out that he had already said that. And at a time when he had a lot less information at his disposal than we have today. So there's some really interesting, and one of the things people who read that chapter on the explorers might notice is that I included only deceased explorers. I only went up to, I don't include anybody who's still alive.
Well, I did not notice that.
Wow. And that was deliberate, actually. First of all, if I included people who are still alive, living explorers and people working today, then that would have been the whole book. But also, once you get into people who are still alive, then you get into the problem of, well, who do you include and who do you not include? And if I include so-and-so, well, then the other person is going to, complain to me, well, why didn't you include me as well? So I thought, okay, I'm just going to keep it safe. I'm only going to include explorers who are already deceased. But it was some of those early explorers in the 19th century who initially dug way down. And it's a very interesting, again, there are descriptions in the book of how they managed to dig down into the area of the foundations of the Temple Mount to find that they go all the way down, many meters below the current ground level to be founded on bedrock. And of course, this is even more impressive at the southern end of the Temple Mount, where the bedrock slopes down, drops off as you go south to the city of David. And there, the foundations go very, very deep. As you go north to the northern end, and especially the northwestern end, the bedrock rises up to where the Antonia fortress that Herod built was located. And there, exactly as you say, where the bedrock rises up, the face of the bedrock was actually cut to look like building stones. It's quite remarkable.
It is.
Yeah.
And definitely, I mean, the Herodian period, we call him the great builder for a reason, right? And the interesting thing about him, of course, is that he's not necessarily, shall we call him, classically Jewish, and yet he's kind of included in our quote unquote Israeli rulers. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, interesting question. Herod, of course, is a complex character. By the way, the chapter on Herodian Jerusalem, which encompasses from archaeologists use the term Herodian to refer not just to the time of King Herod the Great himself, which is 40 until 4 BCE, but also the period after his death, which includes the reigns of his sons and then the various procurators and prefects, the governors who the Romans sent in, up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE at the end of the first Jewish revolt. So that's the period that the Herodian chapter encompasses, and it is actually by far the largest chapter in the book. There's just no way around it. I mean, we have so many remains, and there's so much to talk about. I actually think that the problem, of course, is very well known. I mean, how did Herod conceive of himself? Because he was Jewish on his father's side of the family through forced conversion. His grandfather had been an Idumean who was forcibly converted to Judaism by the Hasmoneans, but Herod's mother was not Jewish. She was a Nabatean woman by today's standards, according to rabbinic Jewish law. Herod, therefore, would not be considered a Jew because it's matrilineal descent. But, Shia Cohen, for example, has written about this. It's not clear that principle of matrilineal descent was universally accepted in the Second Temple period. So exactly how would Herod have been viewed by others, but also how did he consider himself? That's something that's very, very difficult to say. Now, of course, one of the things that he did was to rebuild the Second Temple on a massive scale. Did he do this only because he wanted to win the favor of the Jewish population, who overall, many of them didn't particularly like him? Some of them did, but many of them did not. So was it just to sort of, get them to like him? And therefore the motives would be very cynical, right? Or is it that he genuinely, wanted to dedicate a temple to the great God, right? The God of Israel. I actually think that's also true. I do. But I also think that Herod kind of had a kind of a Roman outlook on the worship of gods. I think the Romans had an inclusive outlook when it came to worshiping gods. It's kind of like, sort of like Hinduism today, where you have this multitude of different deities. And I mean, basically innumerable numbers of deities. And in the eyes of the Romans, every god deserved respect and piety. You should be pious towards all gods. And so they had a kind of a very inclusive view of how to treat gods. And I think Herod actually kind of shared that view. We see him dedicating pagan temples outside of his Jewish territories, for example, at Caesarea and Samaria, but even outside of his kingdom. And so I actually think that, he shared that kind of inclusive Roman view. I have a whole nother, and I don't really talk about it much in the book. I have a different article that I published a few years ago where I also think that Herod, in rebuilding the Jerusalem temple on such a massive scale, was trying to situate himself as having fulfilled the expectations associated with a Davidic Messiah. And so basically situating himself kind of in the line of David and Solomon, even though he of course was not, let's say, fully Jewish, right? He was right. So anyway, that's all, but it's very interesting. He's obviously a complex character, and many scholars have written about him. Yeah.
And are we seeing in Jerusalem of that era, plus minus, also pagan temples?
In Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Oh, no, not in Jerusalem. No, we do have, it's interesting, we do have in earlier periods, if we go back to the Iron Age, of course, right? We do have temples and temples, I guess, probably dedicated to the worship of the God of Israel. I'm assuming, I'm not sure that's actually we know that necessarily, in both around Jerusalem and a little bit more distant, right? So you think about the recently discovered temple at Moza, just outside Jerusalem. We're back in the Iron Age again, right? Or at Arad, for example. And of course, there's Tel Dan with the high place there. And of course, there was the Samaritan temple dedicated also to the God of Israel. But in the area of Jerusalem, by the time we get to the Herodian period, we don't. So now we're going off into a whole nother direction here, which is that I believe, in my opinion, and I've published this, that at the site of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we have evidence that the Jewish sect who lived there, and I believe they were a group of Essenes, that they were offering animal sacrifices there, that site was functioning at least in part as a sort of a kind of a desert tabernacle in exile. We also have, from the Second Temple period, a temple at Leontopolis in Egypt that was dedicated to the God of Israel. There's a slightly earlier temple at Elephantine in Egypt. But in the immediate environs of Jerusalem, no, we don't have anything.
But we have other trappings of Roman life, correct? Meaning little theaters and various things.
Absolutely. And in fact, and I talk about this as well. Herod had games dedicated to the emperor that were held in Jerusalem, and yes, even though we don't have remains that we can identify, he built arenas for Roman types of spectacles, Greek and Roman types of spectacles. So you have the theater and some sort of a hippodrome or stadium. So yes, absolutely, as well as we can see reflected again in the material culture. That at least the wealthier Jews of Jerusalem were decorating their houses in the latest Roman fashion, to some degree adopted Roman types of cuisine, even if they were keeping kosher, but still cooking food in kind of a Roman manner, preparing it and serving it in a Roman manner. So absolutely, we can see various aspects of Roman influence or Hellenistic and Roman influence on the lives of Jews, and again, particularly the elite in Jerusalem, and that's really trickling down as you would expect from the highest levels. So what the ruler, what Herod and his family are doing, kind of those fashions then are imitated or adopted by the people just underneath.
Okay, so now we're up to 70 CE, basically. And of course, this is a major, major blow to the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple. What are we seeing on the ground in terms of the makeup of the city after the Romans conquered it?
Yeah, well, so the chapter that follows the Herodian period is Aelia Capitolina, which is basically Hadrianic Jerusalem. The city lies in ruins for a certain period. The camp of the 10th Legion is here. The 10th Legion was camped in Jerusalem after 70. There are huge debates about where the camp of the 10th Legion was located, leaving that aside. But Hadrian then founds Jerusalem as a colony, Colonia Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony. And as a consequence of the Bar Kokhba revolt, bans Jews from living in Jerusalem and its immediate environs. There is one settlement that has been discovered to the north of Jerusalem in Shuafat in a salvage excavation that I talk about, that was inhabited apparently by a Jewish population and apparently an elite and including apparently also some priestly families between the two revolts. But it appears to have been abandoned at around the time or by the time the Bar Kokhba revolt broke out. So Hadrian's city of Aelia Capitolina consisted of no Jews at all. They were banned from living in the city. And basically what you have then is a population of, either some local people who were not Jews, but mainly, Roman soldiers, Roman veterans, and their families. And that means that it was a relatively small population because by excluding the Jews, you excluded a large part of the population. And the way that Hadrian rebuilds the city is along sort of Roman lines, right? It's kind of got a Roman layout. The Aelia Capitolina, it's a very interesting period. It's probably together with the Persian period, one of the least known periods in the archaeology of Jerusalem. And I think that's for several reasons. First of all, the remains are very difficult to identify. Part of the problem has to do with the dating of pottery of this period, but also because whatever remains there were seem to have been largely obliterated by later overbuilding in the Byzantine period and later periods. And I think also until recently, not so much now, but until in, let's say, fairly recently, it was relatively neglected compared to other periods. And that's because, who's got an investment in Jerusalem? Well, Jews, Christians, Muslims, but the Romans, hey, they're not around anymore, right? So, so it wasn't like people had an investment in what did Roman Jerusalem look like. And so it kind of attracted less scholarly attention. But there is now a lot of work being done on Aelia Capitolina. A lot of it has been done by my friend and colleague Shlamit Wexler-Bdolach, who I mentioned throughout that chapter and also in other parts of the book, who wrote what is really sort of the basic reference now for the city in this period. And she and I have a couple of disagreements on issues, relating to Aelia Capitolina, but overall, she's like the go-to source for whatever information we have on the city in this period.
So you mentioned the local people who were not Jews.
Right.
What would they have been?
Yeah, well, so there were populations in let's say the province of Judea, right, which was what it was for the Romans before the time of Hadrian. There were populations who were not Jewish, right? We know, for example, that places like Caesarea Maritima were overwhelmingly, right, not Jewish. You go into areas to the north, into the area of Samaria, whatever. So there were certainly populations. So it's possible that some of those people were among, so it's possible that we have some of the local non-Jewish inhabitants in the city. But because it's the nature of it, it's a Roman colony. By definition, a lot of the population presumably consisted of members of the Roman military, Roman veterans, military veterans, and their families. And by the way, their families could have also included locals, because a lot of these Roman soldiers, and especially when they became veterans, would intermarry with local women who happened to be around, right? So they would, so that's the kind of population that you would envision. Very interesting. If you look at the remains in the city, we do have quite a bit of evidence for kind of this typical Roman, let's call it pagan Roman presence in, both in the pottery styles, in some shrines that have been discovered around the city, in depictions on coins, things like that. So the character of the city is very different from what it would have looked like before 70.
Wow, amazing. And that period was very short-lived, relatively speaking.
Well, well, that's actually a really interesting question. So how long? So one of the big debates among scholars, and I don't think it's ever been resolved, is how long Hadrian's ban was in effect. How long were Jews prohibited from living in Jerusalem and its environs? When were they allowed to come back and start re-inhabiting the city? And from what I can see among various scholars, the picture that seems to emerge is that either Jews were pretty much still banned, you don't really have Jewish settlement in Jerusalem for hundreds of years afterwards, or if Jews were allowed back into the city, it was a very minor presence. So yeah, it's for hundreds of years. What happens, of course, at some point is that the Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire. So now we're going into the next chapter, right? The Byzantine period. But the Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire. And so Jerusalem becomes a Christian city. But as a Christian city, it still wasn't Jewish. And again, the question is, were there Jews living in Jerusalem under Byzantine Christian rule? If there were, it was, again, a very, very small presence, very, very small, if at all. And so if you talk about, well, how long did it remain like this? It's actually for a very long time, until we get to the Sassanid Persian and then the Muslim conquests in the 7th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, fascinating. I guess part of my question is, these early Christians, were they pagans or were they former Jews?
Yeah, well, that's another great question, right? So who exactly? They were probably both. It's just like everything else. For sure, some of them were Romans who converted, like local population, not Jewish population, who converted to Christianity. But presumably there were Jews who also converted at some point, whether they were living in Jerusalem at that point or not. And the same thing, you could talk about the same kind of process once Islam enters the picture, right? And again, you have a population though. So it's interesting, there are all these kind of modern debates about, who has the right to the country and the city and all of this. And yeah, we were here first. And the fact of the matter is that the picture is so muddy. And what you have is, this kind of new populations coming in, but also the former population staying, but then some of them change religions over the course. And so it's really, this is why I'm very much opposed to archaeology being used as a tool to justify any kind of modern political claims. Archaeology is a science. It should not be mixed with modern politics, and it shouldn't be used to justify anybody's claims, in my opinion, to one side or to the other.
What you just said is exactly my point in asking you about your book in this angle, because your book is so rich and we could speak about so many different topics in it. But what really stood out to me is this shifting population throughout the city. And of course, because of the quote unquote reunification of the capital that was marked this week, I wanted to emphasize to our listeners how Jerusalem has been so dynamic over the millennia. And yes, right now it is run by the Jewish state, and hopefully for many, many years to come. But it is fascinating to hear just how it has been like an accordion, just contrasting and growing, and the city size as well alongside it. Right.
And if we want to talk about a real kind of a break aside from 70, the book ends with the Crusader period. Basically the last period that I cover, it doesn't really end quite with that, but the last period that I cover is the Crusades, which, by the way, I didn't want to include because my expertise goes up through the early Islamic period, which is the chapter right before that. My editor insisted that I include the Crusades because people are interested in the Crusades, and he thought it would sell more copies if it had a Crusades in the title.
But also, wouldn't you say that a lot of what we're seeing in front of our eyes, or maybe not a lot, but some of what we see in front of our eyes is from this period?
So absolutely. Yeah. No. And so I'm in the end, it was kind of a pain for me to do because I was not very well acquainted with the Crusaders, with the period of the Crusades, but I'm glad he insisted. I do like the way the chapter came out. And yes, absolutely. I stress that a lot of the appearance of the old city today does go back to the Crusades. And you can just walk through the streets of the old city and see it in front of you. And I describe that. But if talking about breaks, the Crusades are a real break, because when the Crusaders took the city, they basically massacred the non-Christian inhabitants. And then they were banished. There were no Jews and no Muslims in Crusader Jerusalem, none. So we have another period where there's basically what we would today call an ethnic cleansing of the city, and it's quite dramatic, as a matter of fact. And we have a lot of sources. That's one of the nice things about covering the Crusades. We have a lot of written sources that we can use, and also maps give us a great deal of information. The population was diverse within the limits of being Christian. In other words, there were many different kinds of Christian groups in Crusader Jerusalem, including Eastern Christians and Western Christians, but there were no Jews or Muslims. And so again, if we talk about like kind of tracing the history of the city and its population over the course of time, and you want to look at a major kind of break, you would really want to look at the Crusades. Yeah.
Jodi, I could speak with you for hours and hours, but I've taken up way too much of your time. And so I so appreciate you stopping by today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I hope people will read the book.
I do too. It's great.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's weekly podcast, What Matters Now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan. What Matters Now is produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.